Welcome, everyone. This is Jean-Ric Miller, and I have the great pleasure today to open a new episode of the Sand, Dying, and Living online event, and to welcome Dr. Long, Dr. Jeffrey Long. In the interest of time, I'm going to keep your introduction very short. You are a radiation oncology physician in practice in Louisiana. And you have a hobby. You have studied over 4,000 reports of near-death experiences. And you have published a best-selling book, and you have given countless talks on the subject. Today, we're going to start with a brief presentation of the state of the research in NDEs, and followed by a conversation between you and I. And we will keep some time for questions for the audience. Dr. Long, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. We have a lot of material to cover here, several decades of research, including results from the largest near-death experience study ever presented. So we're certainly going to have a lot to talk about. And it looks like we're going to start at the beginning here. Whoops. Okay, here we go. So we are going to be talking about evidence of the afterlife. There really are some groundbreaking new findings from the largest near-death experience study ever reported. So just so we're all on the same page, I know a lot of you are very knowledgeable about near-death experience, but just so that we're all on the same page, a near-death experience is, as the name implies, you're near death. In other words, you're so physically compromised, you're generally unconscious and may be clinically dead with absent heartbeat, absent respiration. Now, at that time that you're unconscious, and it should be impossible to have a lucid, organized remembrance, you do have the experience part of a near-death experience. And we'll get into that briefly. Now, I want to emphasize no two near-death experiences are the same, but all of us researchers that have studied them see that there are a very consistent pattern of elements, or what occurs during the near-death experience typically occurring in the same consistent pattern of occurrence. So these are the near-death experience elements, and I don't want to go through all of them, but very often you see what's called an out-of-body experience that occurs initially. Consciousness rises above the body. There's heightened senses, typically very positive emotions, the classic passing into or through a tunnel, encountering that mystical light in the end of the tunnel. Deceased relatives are often there, life reviews, often encountering unearthly, or if you will, heavenly realms are commonly reported. And then ultimately at the end, they have to return to their earthly life. So that's very briefly a typical detailed near-death experience right there. Well, I got interested in this over 20 years ago, and because I had a burning question about the reality of near-death experiences, I set up a website. NDERF is the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation. From its inception, it has been a public service. We haven't had anything for sale, and up until very recently, we didn't even have a 501c3 branch. We really wanted to share with the public what had been shared with us freely from people all around the world. And when I say all around the world, I really mean that. We've got portions of that website, the NDE Research website, in over 30 different languages. And remarkably, we have accumulated over 4,000 near-death experiences from people sharing with us. I want you to keep in mind as I go through this, as remarkable as this is going to sound, it's a basic scientific principle that what is real is consistently observed. And you're going to see remarkable consistency in what we've observed in NDEs as we go through this. I really want to give a special thanks to my wife, Jody. She's a licensed attorney, and yet she has devoted her full-time job to the website. She's now the webmaster. That's literally what she does all day long because it's such a huge project. And it's due to her efforts, our labor of love, that we're able to talk about our research from the website today. Well, who has a near-death experience anyway? A Gallup survey published in 1981 found that about 5% of adults in America had a prior history of a near-death experience. After extensive research spanning all the way back to 1975, we absolutely cannot predict who will have a near-death experience or what the content will be. Near-death experiences can happen to anyone, children and adults, physicians and scientists, clergy, religious, even atheists have typical near-death experience, and those who never heard of near-death experience, all of us can have it. Around 10 to 20% of those who nearly die can have a near-death experience. So the bottom line is anyone can have an NDE. And just to emphasize, I'll be using the term over and over, NDE as an abbreviation for near-death experience. Okay, here's how we don't do the research. This is a fake near-death kit. Here's what the skeptics think we do. As you can see, you've got the light at the end of the tunnel, and this person will think they had an NDE. So don't worry, folks. That's not how we conducted our research. But let's get into how we did do it. We published back some years ago my first book, Evidence of the Afterlife, became a New York Times bestseller within 8 days. It's had a huge public interest on the NBC Today show, the O'Reilly Factor that was more impressive until he got in trouble, Dr. Oz show, National Geographic Channel, and even was asked to present at the New York Academy of Sciences. And down here where I live in a small town, southern Louisiana, Houma, Louisiana, extensive local interest. So it's been a lot of fun to do this, as well as very informative and inspirational, literally to tens of millions of people that have heard these shows, presentations throughout the world. What I'm going to talk about are the survey results. The most recent full survey is we have different versions of a survey on our NDERF website. The most recent, the second, I guess, to last survey we had before we closed accrual had 1,122 near-death experiences sequentially shared. In analysis of that data, we found 9 lines of evidence that all converged on the reality that near-death experiences are, in a word, real, and we're going to get into that very briefly. So what are those 9 lines of evidence that we had from my initial study? Well, the first line of evidence is during that period of unconsciousness or clinical death, people have crystal clear consciousness. To understand how amazing that is, consider after a cardiac arrest, well, of course, immediately when your heart stops pumping, blood immediately stops growing to the brain. A measure of brain electrical activity called EEG or electroencephalogram is absolutely flat 10 to 20 seconds after a cardiac arrest. And yet in my study, I found that nearly 75%, 3 out of 4, during that time of unconsciousness or clinical death, they actually were having more consciousness and alertness at that time than during their earthly everyday life, which is absolutely medically inexplicable. The remaining 20% said that their consciousness was normal compared to their earthly everyday consciousness. And only 5%, even though they were physically unconscious, described less consciousness and alertness than their earthly everyday life. Now, it's important to remember near-death experiences are remembered verbatim, literally word for word, decades after their occurrence. All of this is pointing to it being a very special type of consciousness. Well, the second line of evidence, and very important, are these so-called out-of-body observations. A fairly common initial event in near-death experiences is that out-of-body experience. Consciousness separates from that unconscious or clinically dead body. And to me as a researcher, I ask the question, is what they're seeing with their consciousness above their physical body real? Well, about 45% of the time in near-death experiences, they describe ongoing earthly events, often frantic efforts at resuscitating them from their life-threatening event. So my question, are their observations, are what they're seeing real? Well, we've had a prospective study, 2 of them actually, Sabom and Sartori, both found that they appeared to be real. Dr. Jan Holden did an entire literature review of published out-of-body observations and found 92% of the time they were without any apparent inaccuracy. And in my study, the largest of this phenomena, 287 people that had that out-of-body observations, to my astonishment, I found 98% of the time what they described were without any apparent inaccuracy, both in my review and the person who had the near-death experience sharing it. Again, just to understand how remarkable this is, many of these out-of-body experiences involve consciousness far from the physical body and geographically far from any possible sensory awareness. We've had people code in the operating room, consciousness drifts to other parts of the hospital, and almost invariably, what they see and hear, even far from their physical body, is absolutely correct, even if they go back and verify it. So that's certainly a significant line of evidence. Okay, folks, once again, this isn't how we do this type of research. Here's an operating room and a light, and it says if you're reading this, you're dead. So don't worry, we don't really do that. But getting back to some other ways that we do research and find to be evidential, How about visual near-death experiences in the blind? Okay, the blind can vary. You can have those that have been totally blind from birth or develop blindness in life. It can be complete or partial blindness. The toughest test would be those born totally blind and remained blind throughout birth. I've interviewed a lady who had this, Vicky, born totally blind and stayed totally blind. These have been reported in case reports, and remarkably, when people that are born totally blind have a near-death experience, a life-threatening event, they can have vision and have very typical near-death experiences, but with classic content and with classic vision. The one person I interviewed, Vicky, described what's called 360-degree vision. She could see front, back, right, left, and up, down, all simultaneously. It was tough for Vicky, born blind from birth, to understand the rest of us have these sort of pie-shaped visual fields, because don't forget, in her entire life, she only knew spherical, if you will, vision. So absolutely medically inexplicable for people to have that kind of picture-perfect vision. And just to illustrate this, Marta G was a 5-year-old girl who was blind and unfortunately went into a lake, and here's what happened. After Marta went into the lake and she was again blind, I slowly breathed in the water and immediately lost consciousness. A beautiful woman dressed in bright white light pulled me out and looking to my, this is a spiritual figure, looking into my eyes, asked me what I wanted. I was completely satisfied and could think of nothing until it occurred to me to take a trip around the lake. I did and saw detail I would have never seen in real life. I could go anywhere, even to the tops of trees, by simply intending to do so. I was legally blind and for the first time saw leaves on trees, birds' feathers, birds' eyes, details on telephone poles and in people's backyards that were far more acute than 20/20 vision. Mundane details to us, birds' feathers, telephone poles, but if you've never seen it before in your life, it's absolutely amazing. Okay, here's a fourth line of evidence. Under general anesthesia, under adequate general anesthesia, you should have no conscious remembrance at all. If you code, if your heart stops while you're under general anesthesia, which is very well monitored, it should be, if you will, doubly impossible to have a lucid organized experience. However, I studied 23 near-death experiences that were very clearly documented as having occurred during general anesthesia. They absolutely occur. They're typical near-death experiences. In my questionnaire, there were 33 questions pertaining to the elements of the near-death experience, or what actually happens. 32 of the 33 elements occurred equally often in the near-death experience group associated with anesthesia, as compared to near-death experiences occurring under all other types of circumstances. The only difference is the people under general anesthesia that had their near-death experience statistically were more likely to have a tunnel experience. I don't know why. But importantly, my key question about what was your level of consciousness and alertness during this experience, absolutely the same, whether they were under general anesthesia or had their near-death experience under any other circumstance. Powerful evidence right there that near-death experiences are absolutely occurring separate from physical brain function the way that we understand it. Oh gosh, here's another one of these. Oh no, it's an operating room. Okay, as a physician, I want to reassure everybody real quick. This doesn't really happen. We have a operating room light that appears to have fallen on the patient. 10-to-1 when he comes to tell one of those stories about seeing a bright light at the end of the tunnel. For reassurance to all, this doesn't really happen. So moving on quickly. Oh, probably already you're seeing some pretty powerful evidence for the reality of near-death experiences and its consistent message that our consciousness survives bodily death. Well, what do the skeptics say? And that's important to note that over 20 different explanations, so-called explanations, have been proposed by skeptics over the years. You name it, I've heard just about every physiological, psychological, and cultural explanation possible. The reason there's over 20 different explanations is very simple. The skeptics themselves can't agree on any one or several explanations of near-death experience that they accept as adequately explaining NDE. I mean, think about that. If there was really a decent explanation of NDE, it wouldn't have over 20 different explanations competing with each other. But moving on quickly, we'll go through lines 5 of 7 lines of evidence for the reality of NDE. There's a life review. During the life review, which is observed about 17% of the time in near-death experiences, you may see all or a part of your prior life reviewed. Long forgotten memories may be recalled, and when I researched this, I found that when people had a life review, even if they'd forgotten the memories, often in early childhood, if they later checked it out after they recovered from what nearly killed them, they find that even if they forgot it, what they saw in the life review really did happen, even if they'd forgotten it. I always put fear not the life review because some people fear the life review. I can assure you during the life review and near-death experiences, essentially never is there external judgment. You're being shown your prior life. You have to decide and make a judgment, if any, about what you have to think about your own prior life. Certainly in near-death experiences, that's not at all unusual to encounter deceased loved ones. These are joyous reunions, even if people died of disfiguring or illnesses when they were way up in age, they're essentially always picture-perfect health. In my study, I was astonished to find that only 4% of the time beings are encountered in a near-death experience in an unearthly or heavenly realm. Only 4% of the time, these are beings that are alive at the time of the near-death experience.
Oh, uh-oh.
And that's completely different from elusive and met, and that's literally the first time that they encounter them. And I want to emphasize also, deceased beloved pets are often encountered in near-death experiences in these unearthly realms. Once again, joyous reunions. Line of evidence 7, I studied near-death experiences in children age 5 and less. This is sort of an ideal study group because to them, near-death experiences are unknown and unknowable. They have no concepts of death generally. They don't typically won't have any preconceived notions about what should happen when you die. Looking at that same 33 elements of things that occurred during a near-death experience, the near-death experience content was identical. Even though they're culturally practically a blank slate, when very young children have near-death experiences, they're having identical content near-death experiences. A really powerful line of evidence is the fact that near-death experiences have worldwide consistency. You may recall I previously said that portions of our NDE research website are published in over 30 different languages. So we're getting near-death experiences shared literally from all over the world. That has allowed us to do by far the largest cross-cultural study that's ever been possible before. At the conclusion from this extensive study involving hundreds of near-death experiences shared from non-English languages around the world and from over 50 near-death experiences from non-Western countries, bottom line is the near-death experience content, once again, strikingly similar. It doesn't seem to make any difference whether you're, say, a Christian in the United States or a Muslim in Egypt or a Hindu in India. Wherever on the planet you are, if you have a near-death experience, it's going to be strikingly similar. Now, language gets in the way. How do you describe ineffable, unearthly, the kind of remarkable things that people encounter? But if you look at actually what happens, they're remarkably typical. Now, the sternest test of near-death experiences around the world are those that occur in non-Western countries that typically have very different cultural and religious backgrounds. Through my work and also doing several studies with a near-death experience investigator in Iran, and we've published several papers on this, once again, the content appears strikingly similar. The implications of all of this is enormous. Wherever on earth we are, if you have a near-death experience, it seems to be strikingly similar. Really seem to be spiritual beings overall having a human experience here and now in our earth. Line of evidence number 9 is what's called the after effects. In other words, those are the changes in values and beliefs that occur after the near-death experience. Now, I want to emphasize this may take years to fully integrate. When you have an extreme life-changing event, something that is beyond anything you ever thought possible, obviously it can take a long time, often years, to fully integrate those changes in values and belief. But when they do, extensive prospective and retrospective studies of near-death experiences are very consistently finding an increased belief in the afterlife. I mean, that's not a surprise, is it? From the perspective of someone who had a near-death experience, they don't doubt the afterlife because they firmly believe they experienced the afterlife in their near-death experience and they know what lies ahead. Obviously, they have a reduced fear of death for the same reason. They've been through a life-threatening event. They know from their personal belief what happens after they die, and it is certainly good news. They grow to value loving relationships from what they learned during their NDE. They become typically much less materialistic, and certainly a greatly increased belief in God. There's certainly other after effects, but those are the most commonly observed. Now we're going to go on to my more recent research, and this is sort of leading edge, if you will. That was my original 9 lines of evidence for the reality of near-death experience. We're coming up now to number 10, 11, and 12. Number 10, in the survey, I asked 1,122 people that actually had a near-death experience, straight up, how do you currently view the reality of your experience? Look at that, 95.5% people believe their experience was definitely real. Only about 4% say have any doubt at all and say it was probably real, and less than 1% are of the belief that their experience was not real. That is an astoundingly high percentage, and I think you really have to conclude from this data that out of respect for people's ability to generally understand reality, if skeptics want to represent that near-death experiences are not real, they really need to present strong evidence that near-death experiences are not real. And as we've discussed, the skeptics aren't even close. Skeptics can't explain any of the lines of evidence I'm presenting today, let alone all of them together. Moving on number 11, another line of evidence for the reality of near-death experiences are what's called shared near-death experiences. These are fascinating experiences where 2 or more people have a simultaneous, in other words, occurring at the same time, life-threatening event. And then they can not only observe each other, and they can communicate with each other, but they're actually, if you will, sharing the same near-death experience. Like I said, we've had 15 that have been shared with us. They're typical near-death experiences, but they're shared. And I want to illustrate that with a very dramatic account. William shared this some time ago, and this is an example of what can happen during a near-death experience, and this is a shared near-death experience. This is William shares. I was taking my girlfriend to her parents' home in Welland, that's Canada. I went to sleep while driving, then I was aware that we were out of our bodies and quickly flying up towards space, holding hands. They were engaged. We flew straight up for a minute or so when we started to see a park or countryside landscape. Suddenly, we were intercepted by 4 creatures. 2 flanked each of us and began to gently separate us. They overwhelmed us with a feeling of the highest love and compassion that was well beyond anything we could experience on earth. A divine love. We therefore had no resistance to their effort. I recall feeling sort of like a baby in a mother's arms, but it's hard to accurately describe. 2 of them moved her upward toward a distant landscape, and 2 moved me back downward. I felt so much love, peace, and comfort that I wanted to protest and say, no, please, let me stay here. But hearing inwardly, without ears, or psychically, that I could not stay. Next, I could see my car in flames for maybe about a quarter mile up. I felt a sensation of falling and awakened in the car. The front was on fire. I moved her from leaning on me as she was when I fell asleep, knowing that her body was an empty shell. I had left her above with those beings. A very dramatic, very poignant shared near-death experience. They were literally sharing a near-death experience. Very powerful evidence that what's being described in near-death experiences may well be that initial step for those having permanent, irreversible death. Some of the most important recent research I have is there an afterlife? Answer, obviously, yes. So if there's an afterlife, is there God? Well, that's been some of my recent research. I reviewed all near-death experiences shared sequentially over that 3-year period. These were first-person near-death experiences shared in English only. And they had a research scale that was 7 or higher. And they identified an awareness or encounter with God. I was amazed at the consistency in what they described. They over and over described God as overwhelmingly loving, overwhelmingly accepting them of who they are and for all that they are. They have enormously positive feelings in God's presence. God's appearance can be variable, but typically described as an unearthly, brilliant white light. They're usually very certain they encountered God. They often say, what I encountered God is an earthly term, an earthly word. What I encountered was beyond any earthly word. Often God will be involved in sending the person back to their earthly life. It's very common for them to have a powerful sense of unity. And they usually use the word unity more than just a connection. Afterlife or heavenly realms, when they're in an unearthly heavenly realm, just briefly, time and space radically seems different from Earth. They typically say time does not exist. Beautiful landscapes have been described when they're in that unearthly realm beyond anything on Earth. There's buildings and cities. It's always dramatic to me that when they're in that unearthly or heavenly realm, they may describe colors that are beautiful beyond anything that could even possibly exist on Earth. They may describe beautiful music that is so beautiful that it's beyond anything that could possibly be conceivable on Earth, beyond anything that they ever knew. Typically, in these unearthly heavenly realms, they have once again that powerful feeling of peace and love. In fact, the two most common words, among the two most common words used to describe near-death experiences, love and peace. And interestingly, when they're in that unearthly realm, even though that seems so different from our earthly life, there's very often a powerful awareness that this unearthly, this beautiful heavenly realm is their real home. And that seems to be true not only for the person having the near-death experience, but for all of us. A really profound message of hope delivered from those that have had near-death experiences. So thank you very much. We're now ready to have some further questions.
Thank you, Jeffrey. That was pretty amazing presentation of what is known about near-death experience. I'm also interested actually in what is not known. What are some of the questions that are the most puzzling to you, some that you would love to see answers for?
That is a fantastic question. In my years of research, I realized what we do not know about near-death experience exceeds what we do know. We need to learn more about consciousness. How does our earthly consciousness relate to that unearthly consciousness? What about that seeming consciousness that separates at the time of a close brush with death, if you will, a soul? We just need to learn more about that. We need to try to understand more about that unearthly realm. We need to learn more about love. What is that divine, overwhelming sense of love that people that have near-death experiencers, what do they bring back when they come back? It's almost like sometimes they say they bring back a little piece of heaven and they're able to manifest love in their lives later. Again, I think the more we can learn about that and how we can apply that to all of us, for example, are a couple of important questions. There's many more.
Of course. My understanding is that not everybody has a positive near-death experience. There are some that are frightening, marked by intense terror, anguish, loneliness, and despair, according to the words of a journalist that wrote a paper in Scientific American recently. And do you agree with that? And if so, what do you attribute those to?
Yeah. There's sort of two different issues here. One are the frightening near-death experiences. The significant majority of people that start out their near-death experience frightening, I mean, think about it. They had a close brush with death. Their consciousness is over their body. They see frantic efforts at resuscitating themselves. Life-threatening events can be inherently frightening. So a relatively small percentage of people are indeed frightened by all that. For the significant majority of those initial components of fright early on, they go on and have more pleasant, blissful, positive near-death experiences as they present. In my study of truly hellish, if you will, or extremely unpleasant near-death experiences, first of all, they're rare. They only occur about 1% to 2% of the time. And I want to emphasize that even among those people that have some extremely frightening, if you will, hellish components of their near-death experience, the substantial majority of those that learn from their experience and process it and go on to live their life will come to realize that they had issues in their own earthly life. They had that guilt, that fear, that anger, and they'll often say, there was no other way I could have confronted that, learned, and grown. Even people that have had frightening and even hellish near-death experiences come to believe that they're not doomed or fated to have an involuntary hellish existence when they die. And as far as I know, that's true of essentially all near-death experience researchers. That very positive, blissful part of the near-death experience, that heavenly realm, seems to be, to the best of mine and other near-death experience researchers, assessment our destiny.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, the description of near-death experience that we hear are sometimes very similar to experiences that people can have under the influence of psychedelics. So anything from psilocybin to 5-MeO-DMT can generate experiences that are related in the same way that NDEs. So more generally, can people experience NDEs when they're actually not actually close to death?
That's a good question. There's been a lot of interest in that recently. The very most recent near-death experience we posted is absolutely remarkable. I invite anybody interested to go to nderf.org and look at the last experience posted. Scroll down. She compares her near-death experiences with DMT, LSD type of experiences and compares and contrasts them. Just to summarize, there are very striking differences in illicit drug experiences. You're under the control of you feel you're being controlled by the illicit drug. They tend not to have that hyperreal feel to them. You essentially never, or extremely unlikely, are you going to have those out-of-body experiences that are later validated as being real. You're not going to have all those lines of evidence are very uncommon during near-death experience. You do have that intensity of emotion that's common. For anybody who wants to explore that further, I invite you to the website erowid.org. You can see hundreds and hundreds of different types of illicit drug experiences. I've looked them over, and the bottom line is from people that have actually shared illicit drug experiences, they are strikingly, in general, dissimilar to near-death experiences.
Thank you. Well, it's about, do we have any questions from the audience? If anybody has questions, please raise your hand. You know how to raise your hand. You have to click the participant icon. Yes, okay. So I'd like to open the, I'm gonna unmute Claire Elizabeth.
Hello. I'm asking what you've learned about why some people come back, some people come back and when some people don't.
Yeah. Claire Elizabeth, that's a great question. I actually co-authored a scholarly book chapter looking at that issue among others, and even after decades of good research in near-death experience. By the way, there's over several hundred scholarly, peer-reviewed published studies on near-death experience. But even with that volume of research, we simply cannot tell who will or won't have a near-death experience when they have a close brush with death, nor what the content will be. Only about 10 to 20% of people that nearly die will have a near-death experience. So once again, we said that's one of the great mysteries you were asking earlier about. I would love to learn more, but that's an excellent research question. But we still don't know why that is. We don't know for sure. It seems to be, maybe it's some kind of like a grace or a gift for those that have the near-death experience, and we just simply don't know why it happens or not. But it's all or nothing. You either have a near-death experience or you go unconscious and you recover, and there's essentially no lucid organized experience. So that's one of the biggest mysteries we have in near-death experience research. Good question.
And also something else we don't know, if my understanding is correct, we don't know exactly when the near-death experience happens with respect to the person going flatline. If it's during that time, just before, just after. With dreaming, we have some physiological markers, but with NDEs, I understand we don't. Is that correct?
No, that's not really correct. Remember we talked about the out-of-body observation. That's you clearly timestamp observation of ongoing earthly events at the time you're unconscious. You're not really observing events while you're going into unconsciousness as a life-threatening event is starting. You're not really observing ongoing earthly events as you're coming out of consciousness at the end. You're typically seeing your CPR being given, efforts at resuscitation. So we're very clear that that is occurring right during the time that they're unconscious or clinically dead and not before or after. I might add also, when you have a cardiac arrest, a severe cardiac arrest, you're literally amnesic typically for hours prior to the event. And yet people instantly describe with full lucidity that have a cardiac arrest with a near-death experience. Immediately their heart stopped, and typically, boom, they're starting a highly lucid, organized near-death experience. So that's, you're bringing up a skeptic argument. It's just not consistent with overwhelmingly consistent observations in NDE.
Thank you for this important precision. I'm going to unmute Francis.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we
Yes.
can now.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, how often are people with NDE misdiagnosed as having a mental disorder? I think that that's a real tragedy for people to be misdiagnosed as having a mental disorder.
Thank you, Francis. That is an extremely good point. We had a huge problem with that at the dawn of learning about near-death experiences. That was from Dr. Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life, in 1975. For a long time, people would often be diagnosed as having a mental disorder or even psychosis if they dared to share their near-death experience. I can assure you now, as a physician, Francis, that with what we know about near-death experience and its extensive awareness and publication, not only in the media, but in peer-reviewed medical and scientific literature, for anybody to misdiagnose today a near-death experience as a psychotic or severe, or to misdiagnose in that manner, that's literally medical malpractice today. And we haven't, fortunately, it's been many, many years since we've been contacted by somebody that had that serious misdiagnosis. Near-death experiences, as remarkable they are not a function of a psychosis or a hallucinatory experience. They are, as near-death experiencers uniformly believe, an experience of a visit to an afterlife. They're absolutely real. Good question.
Thank you. Jeremy?
Great. Hi. Thank you very much for the research. I've had a near-death experience, although sometimes I like to use the word through-death experience since I came back. And I wrote it up as an ebook. It's called My Death, a personal guidebook. So anybody, it's all illustrated because I'm also an artist. So I wanted to show visual imageries of what the experience was. Two things I want to point out. One, in my particular experience, I actually did go to hell and recognize that hell was in fact a total illusion, because by being dead and therefore having no feelings, I still had consciousness, but I had no feelings. All of the horror that was associated with my particular experience of hell, suddenly I realized truly that in fact, this was all illusion, like watching a movie. And it totally disappeared. And then I took very much classic parts of the journey, which had some of these things I've seen, past lives and tunnels and et cetera. Interesting enough, one of the things about also the experience of past lives that I wanted to point out, and I don't know, Jeffrey, if this has been reported by others, is I had the experience of not just, in fact, not very much my own past life. I had the experience of the entire history of humanity's past life. Everything that I'd ever seen or watched or read about in terms of anything that had ever gone into the particular consciousness of this particular incarnation was experienced in a nanosecond. Everything. And I've not run into very many other, and I've tracked a lot, because as I said, I've written this book about it, and I'm sort of into very much the research that you've done and other people have done. But that's been an interesting thing about the reliving the history of, I'll use this word, humanity, as distinguished from just your specific personal histories. And that seems to have been a bit of a different part of the journey compared to other people who've gone through their NDEs.
Yeah, Jeremy, thanks for sharing that. Two very important points that you raised. Certainly with your awareness of the illusory hellish realm certainly is consistent with what me and other near-death experiencers believe, that there's no permanent involuntary hell. And that's fascinating, the observations of all of humanity. Certainly we have a few dozen near-death experiences that often vividly describe, typically as part of a life review, remembrance of prior lives, lives prior to their earthly life. And these can be very dramatic, very detailed. And for example, one person described a medieval life, and people think it's like, in real medieval era, if it was, knights in white armor and beautiful castles. That's not true. What they described in their NDE is the reality of it. These were walled-in cities. They were muddy. They were impoverished. There'd be beggars. And frankly, it tended to stink because that was how things were back then. So gripping reality from past lives been described. I used to not believe in reincarnation, but wow, after studying near-death experiences, again, being guided by evidence, obviously now I do. The observation of sort of all of humanity is a very panoramic past life, and that's very exceptional, but I sure, we'll keep our eyes out for more of those. Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you. One last question from Pete.
Yeah. Hi. I was wondering what the average length of time people are away and what the longest length of time has anybody been away for a day? And if that might be a problem for the doctors in the operating room, for instance.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Can't hear you. I don't know if you can hear me, but I can't hear you since you started talking.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes. You're
Okay,
back.
good. Yeah, that's great. So again, two ways of looking at it. From the earthly perspective of working with someone who's dying, like with a cardiac arrest, we're getting better and better, but if you're not back in an hour or two, you're almost certainly not going to make it. Fascinating what people describe during a near-death experience where time essentially doesn't exist, which is one of the most common observations people that have near-death experiences make. And in that realm, we've had people describe vastly longer seeming periods of time than that brief period of minutes to typically less than an hour or two during their earthly life. The longest that I can recall is someone who seemed to literally live for years in an unearthly realm, and they actually formed relationships and emotional bonds with that near-death experience realm, and it was very difficult for them to come back to earthly life. So it can extend far beyond that brief period of time of unconscious or clinical death to at least minutes, even hours, days, and on very rare occasions, years. Just an excellent example of the amazing extension of time that's very typically described in near-death experiences. And don't forget, they're unconscious or clinically dead, and yet here they are processing information for hours or even for days while they're unconscious. So it's just a very glaring example of just how amazing consciousness is during near-death experience.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. I wish we had 2 or 3 times as much, definitely. And I'm so grateful that you could be here with us tonight.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you to everybody who's here. Enjoy the conference.